So next up is Tom Basiliere. Tom is the CIO from Provon Health. As Chief Information Officer, Tom has responsibilities for Provon's technology-related functions, information security, product management, including the development of new capabilities that improve the impact of clients, workplace well-being programs. Prior to joining Provon, Tom worked for several enterprise organizations, including Walter Kluwer's, Fidelity Investments, the Boston Company. Tom was recently featured in an interview with CIO Review Magazine on the importance of interoperability and the collaboration in IT. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Bill. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to take a little different twist, although you'll see some common themes in what I'm going to talk about with what John talked about. Tough act to follow. A lot of good information there, and a lot of things that are similar from a personal standpoint and from a business standpoint. But I'm going to focus on risk mitigation in the corporate environment. So I'm going to go through reviewing a few of the things that we've all worked with, especially I know there's a lot of technology people in the room, from a standpoint of how we mitigate risks and some of the traditional methods we've used, and take a little different slant talking about it from an architecture standpoint and applications development, databases, and so on. Go through a few of the things on the new risk landscape. So there's things that, again, John talked about. I'll talk about them from how they're affecting the corporate world, someone in a CIO position, or any of us in IT that are trying to work to mitigate this. And then focus a little bit more on the behavioral side of risk mitigation inside the corporation and things that are emerging in the market right now to try to do that. And I'll close out with some final thoughts. And please, anyone has questions in the middle, interrupt. Let's keep this interactive as much as possible. So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you a little bit about my company. So I work for a company called Provon Health. We're based down in East Greenwich, and we do corporate wellness programs. We develop both services and products for the corporate market for companies who are offering well-being services for their company. We have 13,000 providers and employees across the country. We go into companies of all sizes and conduct biometric screenings, build custom wellness programs for them, and then through software and services help them mitigate healthcare risks and become healthier as an employee population over the course of time. We serve organizations in all size companies, all industries you can think of all over the United States. And from a product standpoint, we have a model that basically works on assess, inspire and engage, and then report and reward. And those are all kind of concepts that it's a continuum, and companies evolve with us over time. So it's healthcare based, which is obviously getting a lot of attention in this world of risk mitigation. And because of that, I've been in healthcare now for about 10 years and in IT for over 30. The one thing I've learned is that most of the things we're trying to do don't vary that much industry to industry. We're trying to protect information. We're trying to help clients grow and expand their business and not have to worry about this stuff if they're working with us as a provider or a vendor. So what are some of the things we've already talked about this morning and things we've been doing for years? As long as I've been in this industry, and I go back to, as early as Y2K and other things that we were doing to try to mitigate risk in our applications and our systems in our IT infrastructure. Policies and procedures have always been around. They date back to probably prior to any technology really being in place to mitigate risk. And those things are still very important, whether it's password security, password expirations, strong passwords, weak passwords. By the way, we touched on this earlier, but what makes a strong password? This is a little bit of a myth sometimes people don't understand. That's one. Length is very important on password, but if you have a password that you have to write down because it's so cryptic you can't remember it, it's probably not a strong password. And one of the things that, I remember, this is years ago, probably 15 years ago, I worked for a company where the CEO was not all that tech savvy. And he had a computer in his office, but all he used it for was to put sticky notes on. And he had his passwords on there so that he would remember them. That's probably not a good way to protect your password. So a strong password is one that is unique, is cryptic, isn't cryptic. It's something you can remember, but it's unique enough that it's not something someone's going to engineer very easily. So you have to keep all those things in mind. Physical access controls, again, one that a part of risk mitigation and security. It's been around for a long time. Obviously, it's getting more advanced with cameras and actually listening devices in a lot of companies because that technology is readily available. The network intrusion, we talked a lot about that already. John talked a lot about that. There's so many facets of that. I think in the bigger company you are, the more access you have to some of these tools, and whether it is regular vulnerability scans and pen tests or ongoing monitoring, those things are absolutely critical and will continue to be. The companies that are focused on those kinds of tools and protections are constantly updating them, and there's no substitute for that at the base level to protect your network and your servers. But the other one that we've been working on for the last 10 or 15 years is saying, okay, great, my data center is protected, it's locked, it has limited access, my network and my servers are segregated onto subnets, and that's all good, but what about the software that's running on those servers? That's accessible, and it's protected even with simple passwords, but the stronger password authentication you have, that's good. Multi-factor helps. But at the software level, there are things that if you don't do them correctly, no matter what those other protections are, you're really not going to be in a good position. This is something I coined the layers of vulnerability, and it's obviously pretty simple and somewhat intuitive, but I think it's one that's worth talking about a little bit. The physical access controls, the electronic access controls that we obviously deal with now, are now bubbling down into how is your data architected, and more importantly, how is your sensitive data protected differently from regular data. You can have, FAQ documents, and you can have non-sensitive information that if it got out and if it got into the wrong hands, it's not going to dramatically corrupt your business. Then you have the real sensitive information. If you're a public company, obviously the financials come into play. If you're a healthcare company, protected health information is very sensitive data. And you have to look at that differently, and you have to think about it differently. And your engineers and your database architects have to be thinking about that as well and understand how to engineer security into the applications from the beginning. So, simple example in the healthcare world is we're dealing with PII. How many people know PII, protected individual information, and PHI, protected health information? So you're dealing with a situation where you've got people's names and their social security numbers and birth dates, and you talk about the Equifax hack. Obviously, it was dealing more on your left side of this picture with the PII, and on the right side of this, in the healthcare world, we're dealing with additional information. You go into a hospital and you're talking about not only someone's basic biometric information, but all their medical records. And that is highly sensitive and frankly, highly regulated. There's many government regulations that if you're in this business, you are working very hard to protect this. And the fines for exposure of even one individual's health information are extraordinary. So it's very, very important to do that. If you take this data together and you store it together and you protect it the same way, you're taking the first step. But if you take the second step and say, well, there's very limited access that's needed to know who the individual is and some of their basic protected their individual information. And if I know who you are, there's a lot I can do with that. The other attributes of your profile that are, in this case, the example, your height, your weight, your blood glucose, your blood pressure, what kinds of conditions you may be dealing with. Knowing that information without knowing who you are is frankly pretty useless. I could give somebody a file with every patient that is in a hospital, a local hospital, without any identifying information. And obviously, without the identifying information, it's not very useful. So when you think about architecting your systems, whatever business you're in, and financial services would follow the same model, think about the data that you're protecting and what, down to the attribute level, what is really important. all databases, major database vendors today allow you to encrypt at the column level. It's not good enough to look at how you're doing that across all the information you have and look at it the same way. So that's something that, you know, it's not a new concept, obviously, but it's the next level of securing information and securing your overall systems that really can differentiate you to your clients and obviously looking at security a little different way. So do those traditional techniques work? Well, here's a few quotes about what's happening today around protecting information and about risk. From Akamai. Akamai is a big distributed content provider, content distribution network. You know, recent trends are showing many more attacks now in the healthcare space than in financial services. The 22% of breaches since 2009 were due to unauthorized access and theft or loss of encrypted devices or computers. That's creating a huge breach risk. That's from Healthcare IT News. These next couple are really where I want to focus more of the remainder of my time is around workers and engagement. So a recent Gallup poll showed that 70% of US workers across all industries are really not engaged at work. Now you come to work, you do your job, you go home, but that's different than being engaged. So I know we went through and polled earlier about the size companies that people are from here. If you're from a company of 10 people or 50 people, engagement is a little easier. The bigger your company gets, the harder it gets. And when I say engagement, I mean not only engaged in what your company does, but engaged in your clients and engaged in the culture that you're trying to provide and the real mission you're on as a company. Those are very important concepts to get people engaged, and that'll come out in some additional things I have to say about how that relates to security and risk. And this last quote by the Energy Project, even if you are engaged at work, only 34% of employees are really engaged in their company's mission. So some of the new risks, again, John touched on some of these, and I won't go through them all in detail again. One that I would talk about on the cell phone side that we didn't get into was really around what's happening with the device manufacturers and the telecommunications companies. They're getting more and more pressure to open up how their devices work at the hardware level for the Apples and the Samsung. I'm sorry, for Apple and Google on the Android side, because the software manufacturers want to take advantage of the hardware more. So APIs at the chip level and in the inside of that device are creating another exposure area where that used to be a very, very closed network. That's one that, again, I think in general, the concept of application interfaces and more access points are creating more risk. It's harder to mitigate and harder to protect the very edge of your access, the more those devices become open. John talked about Internet of Things, but the one thing I would add to that in our space is the use of wearables. And you know, whether it's an Apple Watch or some other healthcare device, there's Bluetooth scales, there's glucose monitors. There's a lot of things that we're looking at to help our members and our patients and our clients get healthy and stay healthy. It also creates another data access point. And to some of the things we already talked about, that open source concept and those open APIs, again, are something that you have to be really watching closely and protecting against. In the corporate world, again, public or private, if you're doing business with other companies, and I would argue that probably every one of us in this room have clients or we wouldn't be in business, those clients' expectations are rising every day. I think the biggest thing I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is not only related to the space you may be in, whether it's financial services or education or healthcare or whatever else it might be, manufacturing. The regulatory environment has changed a lot around security, but also the clients themselves, the bigger they are, they've always had very high expectations of their partners and their vendors. That bar and the size vendor you may be is dropping dramatically. And just as an illustration, back in 2010, 2012, if you were a billion-dollar company, you tended to have a lot of some focus on security. You probably had dedicated information security resources in your company. You probably spent a decent percentage of your IT budget on scanning and on protections and on firewalls. And the smaller your company got, the less you focused on that. If you were a very, very small company, a startup providing a single service to a bigger company, there really wasn't a lot of expectation that you were protecting a lot of things at your edge of the network. You weren't necessarily held to very stringent annual audits or vendor security risk assessments or things like that. That started to get a little more difficult or a little more specific as time went on. And right now, I would argue that regardless of the size company you're in, if you're working to expand your business and your clients are of any size or scale at all, you're going to be asked to do these kinds of things. The regulatory environment and the audit environment is getting stricter and stricter every day, and to keep up on what's going on with all of it is very difficult, and the smaller you are and the less dedicated resources you have doing this, it's even more difficult. So does that resonate with anyone here about what they're seeing from a standpoint of their clients' expectations of them as a provider of services? Yeah, getting some head nods there. Yeah, it's an opportunity, and it also helps you stay educated because a lot of time the companies that you're working with are telling you what you should be doing, even if you're not as educated as you need to be. But in general, this trend is going to continue. So, back to that levels of security, what do you do about that? All of the traditional things that you're doing, obviously important, obviously continue to be important and will help. But the big thing that you've got to think about internally with your employees is about behaviors. So back to that engagement, some of those engagement stats. If people aren't engaged at work, if they're not thinking about this all the time, who wants to think about security? Early on, what we were doing is we would prevent security incidents from happening. And if somebody did something, even mistakenly, there was punishment involved. So how do you flip that around and focus more on encouraging good behavior and on educating not just once a year when you do education training as part of either onboarding employees or as a regular annual thing, but how do you do it every day? And how do you make things different and better for the whole company by making your employees helping your employees become more engaged in this? So ask yourself a few questions. Do your employees have a stake in the company's success? And I'm not talking about necessarily financial success, but I'm talking about, do they really have a stake in your mission? Do they understand what risks are? And do they constantly have incentive to look for those and look for ways to mitigate them? Do they know how to spot a risk? It's one thing to say you see someone walk in the front door who doesn't look like they belong there. Physical access controls and policies can prevent that. But if they see a document laying around that really doesn't look like it should be there, it shouldn't be unprotected, it's got some client information on it, do they know that it's okay to pick that thing up and do something with it? And a lot of this does come back to the evolution of policies and procedures, but it also is having tools available to them so that they constantly get reminded of what they should be doing to mitigate this risk. So education is important, but there's a lot of new techniques, just like we're seeing in social media and everything else, right? We always all have our phones on us. How can we reinforce good behavior? How can we make security fun? And it may sound like an oxymoron, but it's just like any other behavior you're trying to reinforce. If you can make it enjoyable and you can make it a positive thing, you can help people understand that it's okay to, you're not calling out a co-worker, you're not putting the company at risk by bringing something up, you're helping the company avoid a problem. So obviously, if you're working on behavior change, psychologists will say you've got to start small. You've got to start with one thing. When we're helping people change their health behaviors, you try to look for something that they are ready to do. If they're a smoker and you want them to stop, and they should stop smoking, but right now they're really not ready to tackle that problem. They're looking to do something like exercise a little more. You start there. And so the same goes for this area. You look for areas where people are comfortable and they have enough information, or because of what they do within your company, what operational area they're in, it makes sense for them to start looking at that. If they're working in a call center or they're working in the finance area, there are different things that just by the nature of their job, they're going to see and get exposed to. So you want to find ways to help them understand that these are things in your area that if you do them, they're not only going to help protect the company, help mitigate risk, help protect our clients, but help the company overall be more successful from a perspective of risk. Showing where you have successes in this area. I mean, you know, security and risk mitigation are areas that people are, they're faux pas. They're not ones that are talked about a lot when someone does something right. Make sure that you reinforce these, even if it has to be anonymous, that, you know, we prevented X number of potential breaches or potential security incidents at the company this month. Simple things that can help the employee population say, wow, not only are these important to the company, but senior management's watching them and they take them seriously. And they are rewarding in some form or another this good behavior. You know, burying the information that's going on inside your company, just like when you have a sale, you know, you have a new sale and everyone celebrates it. You need to celebrate your successes in the risk mitigation area too. And get everyone talking about it. Have them collaborate on it. You'd be shocked at how many great ideas your employee population can come up with because they're on the ground. They're seeing things every day that you can very easily lose sight of from a management standpoint, or even if you're in an information security role. Because the regulations are part of it, but the people who are touching the information and working with the clients and seeing the types of attacks that are happening as they learn that are really your best source of information. And you know, last but not least, I would tell you that depending on how much your company is able to invest in this, how much you know, you have dedicated to looking at these types of things behaviorally or from a you know, from a security standpoint, a technical security standpoint, enlist a partner and go to sessions like this, because the experts know a lot, and there's not that many out there that know everything. And because of that, you really need to educate yourselves and keep that information available to the people in your company that are focused on this. Can't say strongly enough how much, in my job, I have gone from spending 5 or 10% of my time in the area of risk mitigation and security to probably more like 30 or 40% of my time. It's because there's so much to keep up on and so much to learn, and we do have dedicated information security people, but there's still more than we can possibly keep up with. So there's always important to keep partners involved. So I went through a lot fairly fast. There was some overlap with John. I didn't want to repeat too much, but I will say that a couple final thoughts. A little motherhood and apple pie here, but prevention is a lot easier than having a breach and a lot less expensive. Nobody wants to go through that as a public company, as a private company, as an individual. It's worth it to spend some time on the prevention side, and I can't stress enough again about the behavioral piece of this. There's a lot of technologies out there. There's a lot of things that the traditional techniques that work and are really important. And frankly, regulation is a little bit behind in the sense that it still focuses on a lot of those things, but those are very important. But the behavioral side is something you've got to look at, work it into the fabric of how your company operates, work it into the fabric of how your employees are evaluated and how they're rewarded, and make that something that you do. No matter what your business, you're always balancing the risk of a breach or the risk of an incident with the need to operate your business. Again, probably a little motherhood and apple pie, but you do have to think about that a lot. You can go too far in some of these areas where you've locked things down so much that you can't operate, and you really got to balance that. But you've got to. That's a very individual decision, company by company. And then the awareness training, the security training, the understanding of what's happening in the world and happening in the risk industry. It's not a once a year thing. You have to reinforce it, whether it's a monthly program, whether it's quarterly, whether it's every day. It's going to vary. There are companies out there working on solutions that help you do this, but in the short term, a lot of it's going to be up to you as an individual to design some kind of program, work with your HR, your communications groups, and find ways to do this on a regular basis because it's very important. Change happens when employees understand the reasons your business exists. Engagement, engagement, engagement. And that's really the last thing I'd want to leave you with. So thank you very much. If I can answer any questions, I'd be glad to do that. Thanks.
Well, that wraps up everything this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to come over. Thank you everyone on the webinar for joining us. We have mouse pads and pens on the desk. Please feel free to take that. We have shirts for the folks that are on the webinar. We can send these out. At the front desk also, when you're leaving, we have a certificate of appreciation for coming over this morning. And again, thank you so much. Appreciate it.